This is Land of Havilah, Matthew 18, verse 1. In that hour the disciples came to Jesus, saying, Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus called a little child to himself and set him in the middle of them, and said, Most certainly I tell you, unless you turn and become as little children, you will in no way enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whoever therefore humbles himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him that a huge millstone should be hung around his neck and that he should be sunk into the depths of the sea. Comment. Putting this together with the preceding passage and with the account of the same event in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and Peter were at the house in Capernaum, and some of the other disciples were on their way to the house, when the ones on the way began arguing among themselves which of them was the greatest. When they arrived, Jesus surprised them by asking, What were you arguing about on the way? The disciples fell silent because they realized Jesus knew the answer before he asked. At that point, Jesus sat down, it says. In other words, he went into teaching mode and set a certain child in the middle of them. He said, Whoever humbles himself as this little child, the same will be the greatest. He didn't say, Be humble like a child, because on the scale of humility, a child can be on either end. A child can be amazingly disrespectful or humble, depending on the child, and depending on what kind of mood he's in. He said to be humble, quote, like this little child, end quote, like the certain child he put in the middle of them, who happened to be behaving humbly at the time. Perhaps they knew the child, since Capernaum was home for them, and the child was in the house with them. If so, they would have known the child's character, that he was generally humble. And the child was a he, as it says in verse 2. The line was very memorable about it being better to be thrown into the middle of the sea with a huge millstone around the neck than to cause a little one to stumble. It's obviously a warning to us how we should protect the innocence of a child and not expose them to evil. But it also says something about how God behaves. Far be it from him to be that guy who leads his children astray, who tempts them. God tempts no one, James 1:13. Since he said what he said about the millstone, he would be the last one to tempt us. Continuing now about stumbling, verse 7. Woe to the world because of occasions of stumbling, for it must be that occasions come, but woe to that person through whom the occasion comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life maimed or crippled rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into the Gehenna of fire. Comment. Going back to verse 6, woe to him who causes a little one to stumble. Then in verse 7, woe to him who causes anyone of any age to stumble, and woe to the one who stumbles. If a child lives long enough, he will see evil. Someone will eventually expose him to it, but we don't want to be that one. God takes extreme exception to anyone who causes another to stumble in verses 6 and 7. He'll deal with them severely. But he didn't say he would stop them. On the contrary, he said it was inevitable that occasions of stumbling should come. As to what he would do for the child or person that stumbles or sins, that's coming up, that he'll seek the stumbler until he finds him. After speaking about stumbling in verses 6 and 7, Jesus immediately transitioned into cutting off body parts in verses 8 and 9, that we should cut off any body part if the part causes us to stumble. So the question is there a body part that causes us to stumble? If we were to cut off every part and leave only ourselves with our vital organs, we would still sin. What Paul said would still be true, that severity to the body isn't of any value against indulgence of the flesh, Colossians 2:23, but it might be of value in protecting someone else. We should do whatever is truly helpful in avoiding sin and in avoiding exposing others to evil. Coming up, all this has to do particularly with protecting children. Verse 10. See that you don't despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. Comment: what does it mean to despise a little one? It means to treat children disrespectfully, to expose them to evil, and it extends to any vulnerable person. Little ones have angels, and their angels are well connected. They're in direct contact with the Father in heaven. Quote, their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. End quote. The implication is that if someone fails to treat a child with respect, the report will get back to the Father. Speaking of angels helping us personally, they aren't just for children. Angels are, quote, ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation. Hebrews 1:14. Coming up, there's a short parable about little ones who've been lost, meaning separated from God. And it is about little ones, as it says in the last verse. Verse 11, for the Son of Man came to save that which was lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, doesn't he leave the 99, go to the mountains, and seek that which is gone astray? If he finds it, most certainly, I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Comment: Christ is on a mission to seek and save little ones who stumbled, which is all of us, but particularly in this context, children, or adults who stumbled during childhood. He'll leave the 99, focus on the one who's lost, and rejoice over that one when he finds him. In verse 14, the Father's will is for everyone to be saved. It's not his will that any should perish. Coming up, some commandments about dealing with a wayward brother, very easy to understand. Verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go show him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained back your brother. But if he doesn't listen, take one or two more with you, that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the assembly. If he refuses to hear the assembly also, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Comment: if a brother sins against us, the first step isn't to run him down in the presence of others. We should go to that person in private. If he won't listen, we recruit 1 or 2 more to come with us and try again. If he still won't listen, we should tell it to the assembly, and the assembly should deal with it. If he won't listen to the entire assembly, he should be considered not a part of the assembly. As far as the assembly's decision on the matter, verse 18, most certainly I tell you, whatever things you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever things you release on earth will have been released in heaven. Again, assuredly I tell you that if 2 of you will agree on earth concerning anything that they ask, it will be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the middle of them. Comment: in verse 18 regarding binding and releasing, if an offender listens and repents, the assembly will declare him bound, meaning he'll still be included in the assembly. If he doesn't listen, the assembly will declare him released, meaning he'll no longer be part of the assembly. When the assembly makes its decision, the same decision will take place in heaven, or heaven will have already made the same decision, and the assembly is simply agreeing with heaven. Usually if someone is in sin and the assembly confronts him about it, he'll be offended and voluntarily remove himself, gladly. You couldn't keep him there if you tried. But if he's that unusual person who's intent on staying, he must be expelled. There's more about binding and releasing in the last chapter. It applies to a lot more than church discipline. In verses 19 and 20, if 2 or more agree on anything in prayer, it will be done for them. Or another way of saying it, God will bind it or release it in heaven. If it seems we don't receive what we ask, we should be patient, remembering that many of the patriarchs never received on this side of the grave many of God's promises, but they eventually received them all. Hebrews 11:13. Coming up, a 15-verse parable with 1 point. Forgive others, and God will forgive you. Don't forgive others, and God won't forgive you. Verse 21. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Until 7 times? Jesus said to him, I don't tell you until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to reconcile accounts with his servants. When he had begun to reconcile, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Because he couldn't pay, his lord commanded him to be sold, with his wife, his children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and knelt before him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will repay you all. The lord of that servant, being moved with compassion, released him and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants, who owed him 100 denarii, and he grabbed him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you. He would not, but went and cast him into prison until he should pay back that which was due. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were exceedingly sorry, and came and told their lord all that was done. Then his lord called him in and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant, even as I had mercy on you? His lord was angry and delivered him to the tormentors until he should pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father will also do to you if you don't each forgive your brother from your hearts for his misdeeds. Comment: when someone wrongs us and repents of it, it's our golden opportunity to do ourselves a favor. If we're patient and forgiving with the offender, God will be patient and forgiving with our offenses. If he sins against us 70 times 7, which is so many times that we've lost track, each time we have another opportunity to do ourselves a favor and forgive. God says in verse 33, Shouldn't you also have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? Matthew 19 is next at landofhavilah.net, Matthew 19.